Welcome to the Club Book with Mohsin Hamid. I'm your host, Masood Yunus, an entrepreneur and a founding member of Pakistani American Society of Minnesota. Before I introduce today's guest properly, allow me a moment to tell you a bit more about the unique series that are bringing him to us. Club Book is a program of MELSA, the Metropolitan Library Service Agency, made possible through Minnesota's Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund and coordinated by Library Strategies, part of the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library. Ramsey County Library is the co-organizer of this afternoon's talk. Thanks also to partnering bookseller Red Balloon Bookshop. A purchase link to The Last White Man will be available in the comments section of this live stream feed. Have it shipped, pick it up at the lovely store in St. Paul, or have them deliver it personally to your door if you are in the area. One final housekeeping note, also in the comments, you will see a survey link. Melsa would greatly appreciate hearing what you think of this club book program. It's quick and easy. Now for our featured event. British Pakistani novelist Mohsin Hamid's international bestsellers have been translated into an astounding 40 languages. They include The Reluctant Fundamentalist and Exit West, two novels shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize, and How to Get Filthy Rich in Rising Asia, which won the Tiziano Terzani International Literary Prize. Hamid is also an in-demand journalist and op-ed contributor with a byline readily recognizable to readers of The Guardian and the New York Times newspaper. Hamid's latest book, The Last White Man, is a reimagining of Franz Kafka's classic novella, The Metamorphosis. In it, Anders, a white American, wakes up to discover that his skin has inexplicably turned a deep and undeniably brown. What's more, he's not alone. In a starred review, Kirkus calls The Last White Man a brilliantly realized allegory of racial transformation, speaking to a more equitable future. Sources as varied as Time, Entertainment Weekly, and Elle named it one of the best books of summer 2022. We will have time for audience Q&A as well. Simply drop your questions in the comments thread here on Facebook, and our tech manager will route them to me. With that, I'll hand it over to Mohsin Hamid. Off to you, sir.
Thank you, Masood, and thank you, everyone who's been involved in putting this together. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm speaking to you right now from my study in Lahore, Pakistan. The novel, The Last White Man, is a pretty strange book. It begins, as Masood says, with a young man named Anders. And Anders has gone to bed. And when he went to bed, his skin was light. And when he wakes up, his skin is dark. And he tries to make sense of what's going on. Why has this happened? How should he interpret this? What does it all mean? And he reaches out to his girlfriend, Una, and asks her to come have a look at him. And he's hoping she'll say that, you still look the same. But she doesn't say this. She says that you look like a completely different person. And Anders spends some time, hoping to go back to the way he was, to be the person he was before. But he doesn't go back. And as time passes, he has to go out into the world. And he finds that people are reacting to him differently. He also finds that he is different, that the way that people see him affects how he is seen. And the novel sort of explores a world where, in a way, race starts to disappear, or our ability to recognize, what race we belong to starts to disappear. It's actually set in an unnamed country, so we don't know the country where Anders and Una are having this experience. A lot of readers have read it and said this is clearly the United States. Some other people have said that it feels like Britain or Norway or South Africa. And in a sense, the book is open to the reader reading into it uh, the place and the situation that the reader wants to imagine this happening. Anders and Una are two of the main characters, and in a way, the novel is a story of three love stories. One love story is Anders and Una, and how their relationship changes in this world where Anders has become dark, and where other people start to become dark. There's also two other love stories. One is the love between Anders and his father, and they're a slightly estranged pair. They haven't always got along very well. And Anders' father is sick. He's in fact dying. And he's trying to, in a sense, protect his son from these developments at the same time as he's grappling with his own mortality. And Una's love with her mother is the third relationship. Una's mother is somebody who has come to believe, in a way, that white people are being erased, that white people are under threat, that white people are no longer safe. And this transformation that starts to happen of people becoming dark, in a way, for her at first, feels like her worst nightmares coming true. Now, Una and Anders are similar in the sense that they both experienced a big loss. Anders lost his mother when he was a teenager. Una lost her father at the same age, and Una's brother has died just before the novel begins. And so these are two families that are grappling with loss. And that story of loss, of personal loss, gets wrapped up in this sense of a loss of identity and this world of turmoil as society gets upended. And I guess the last thing I'll say about it is a little bit of the origin story of the book, which is, I think that the idea to write something like this, or what became the idea to write something like this, goes back a little bit more than 20 years. So in the year 2001, in the summer of 2001, I had lived in America more than half my life. I was 30 years old, and I'd lived in Pakistan for a little bit less than half my life, in America for a little bit more than half my life. And I'd lived in, cosmopolitan places, the Bay Area, Boston, New York City. I was living in New York in the summer of 2001. I just moved to London, in fact, in September of that year. And I had gone to these sort of elite universities. I had a well-paying job. And if you asked me, would I have thought of discrimination as one of the main challenges that I faced in life, I would have said probably no. I was aware, of course, that there was racism in America and everywhere. I was aware that people did face discrimination, and I'd encountered discrimination myself. But by and large, living in New York City in 2001, with a well-paying job in Manhattan, I felt, pretty able to go about my business and do my life without too much encumbrance. And then the terrorist attacks of September 11th happened. And sort of almost overnight, I saw myself being viewed differently. And at the airport, I would always be pulled out of line and given extra security. At immigration, when I'd fly into JFK, they pulled me aside and put me in a room for a few hours and asked me questions. And on the weekend, you get onto a bus, a little bit, unshaven, maybe with a backpack or the subway, and people would maybe want to switch seats or look at you a bit funny. And I thought that it was so strange that, I haven't changed. I'm exactly the same person I was yesterday and the week before and the week before that, but suddenly people are looking at me differently. And I think from that experience, I formed the, impression that the way we're seen, our race, our ethnicity, our appearance to other people is often imagined onto us by what other people think. When somebody looks at us and sees us in a different way, we don't have to change for that to have enormous power over their experience. And so I think I spent quite a bit of time wanting things to go back to the way things were. Let's go back to how it was before 9/11. But then I began to ask myself, why do I want that? Maybe it's better to look at this and to say, even if I had dodged the worst of discrimination, etc., before 2001, instead of wanting to be on the right side of the discrimination barrier, maybe I need to look a bit more carefully at this whole idea of discrimination and racism myself. Maybe I had been complicit in a system that perpetuates this. And instead of sort of slipping back into just a sense of comfort with it, I should ask myself some hard questions about what was I doing and what is this? And so when Anders experiences something in a way similar, the idea that he's suddenly seen differently by people, and he has to grapple with what that means and who he is, and what kind of world he lived in, and what kind of world he wants to live in a weird way. Although this is a novel about four people who think that they're white in a small town, possibly in America or someplace else, I do feel at the same time that it's an imaginative journey I wanted to make, because it was something I wanted to investigate from my own experience as well. So I'm going to pause there, and hopefully Masood and I can have a bit of a conversation, and we can take some questions from you at the end. But Masood, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mohsin. That was quite insightful too. I read the book cover to cover, and I basically read a couple of chapters over and over again too. I do have a questions, but I think we'll take some questions from our audience first. So just for the audience online here, while you are on the Facebook Live page, you can feel free to basically drop your questions or your comments onto the Facebook note, and then we can basically follow up with Mohsin here and ask him those questions too. I do have a few questions that have already came in. Mohsin, if you're okay taking some of them now.
Sure.
Very good. So the first question is, the last white man inspiration and interplay with Franz Kafka are obvious enough. What other works influenced Mohsin Hamid, with the latest book for sure, but perhaps also more generally?
So, I tend to think that when I think of influences, the works of literature that come to mind for me are they sort of fall into, I guess, three main areas. One set of stuff is a lot of 20th century modernist writers, people like Kafka, but also like Jorge Luis Borges and Virginia Woolf and Calvino, Camus, who were playing with form and doing experiments about how a novel could be built and how you could twist a story and how you could make stories work in different ways. And they wrote, in the 1920s, they wrote 20s to, let's say, 60s, 70s even, but mid 20th century, early to mid 20th century. They were writing in a time of war, in a time of technological change, in a time of terrible violence. And in a sense, their time is not maybe that different from our time. We also live in a time of real dramatic change. And so I think the modernists, to me, remain interesting. The second, I guess, bunch of writers were writers that I encountered in my late teens and 20s, politically minded writers, often from the global South or African American writers. And I would think here of people like Chinua Achebe and Toni Morrison, James Baldwin. From Pakistan, Sadaf Hasan Manto, very important Urdu language writer. And these writers, in a sense, in different ways, were exploring how to deal with a very troubling political reality, through fiction. And I've always been fascinated by some of their experiments and by many of their books. And the last group of writers that I've, I guess, always been attracted to, influenced by, are the Sufi poets. So in the sort of Muslim literary tradition, there's what you might call a sort of a mystical strand of poetry, where the relationship between human beings and the divine is often talked about in terms of love stories. And so these love stories by poets like Rumi, poets like Atar, these love stories would often explore the relationship between people, the universe, through the story, through a story of love. And I've always been interested in that idea of sort of love as a transformative element. And in a way, this novel is built in a sense of three such love stories. But yeah, those are, I guess, would be my three immediate influences that come to mind.
Very good. Thank you, Mohsin. Just for our audience who are listening in, or maybe you just tuned into our Facebook Live, simply drop your questions in the comment thread here on Facebook, and our tech manager will route them to me. If you had preferred to contribute a question a bit more anonymously, you can also send a private message to Club Book here on Facebook, or send an email to clubbookmn@gmail.com. Thank you. Mohsin, you talked about Sufism there a little bit too, right? So there is, I being Pakistani descent as well, right? I'm inspired by the Kalam of Baba Bulle Shah, for example, right? There is Sufism that actually stretches all the way from Pakistan, India, all the way up to Turkey, right? Are there any international Sufis or any international personalities that also inspire your work?
You mean from like a Sufi tradition or just generally?
Sufi tradition.
Well, I mean, there's so many. So within the Sufi tradition, there come lots of, I guess, offshoots. So when I was growing up, I remember hearing Nusrat Fateh Ali perform and meeting him live once. And Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan was a one of the great Pakistani singers. He was a qawwal, and qawwali is I guess a form of what you might call devotional music. In American terms, I think maybe I'm not sure gospel is quite the right way to compare it, but it's music of that nature, music that touches the spirit and is sort of ecstatic. And one thing which I thought that Nusrat Fateh Ali did beyond his his amazing performances and his willingness in a way to collaborate with all kinds of musicians all over the world, was that he was intent on playing with form. So at some point, he was comfortable moving beyond traditional qawwali into all sorts of other different experiments. And whether that's, with Peter Gabriel or Eddie Vedder or, on some remix soundtrack out of Britain, I thought that there was something quite incredible about taking this traditional form with ancient roots and moving it into all these unexpected new directions. And so he's certainly somebody who comes to mind in terms of a more contemporary, I don't know if influence is quite the right word, but inspiration.
Very good. Thank you, Mohsin. We have a question here from the audience. What is your training as a writer? Your style, particularly in this latest best, it starts in the most beautiful day. No sentence does not land, and each word has a purpose. That's what makes me curious.
So, like any writer, I guess I began as a kid, reading, and I used to read a lot, and I probably did my first, I suppose, attempt at writing a book when I was in third or fourth grade in one of these class notebooks where I doodled out a kind of imitation of Star Wars, some kind of, galactic space opera with little stick figure illustrations and spaceships and all this kind of stuff. But I never took it, I guess, particularly seriously, thinking that I would be a writer. I read a lot. I also had a very active imagination. So I was always, in a fantasy world, like imagining stuff and dreaming of stuff. And then when I got to university in the States, I went to Princeton, and there's a woman down the hall who told me she was taking this creative writing class. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, well, you write short stories, for class, a few short stories. And I said, wait, so the entire class is you just write a few short stories, that's all you have to do? And You get a regular university credit? He says, yeah. And by the way, it's also pass fail. And I thought, wow, that sounds like a very like fun and interesting thing to do. So I'm going to try to do that. So I wound up taking a total of 4 creative writing classes while I was at Princeton. And the first one in my first year, and then I took, I think, one in my second and one in my third. My second and third classes were with Joyce Carol-Oates, who was a fantastic teacher and a fantastic writer. And then in my senior year, I took a long fiction class that was offered by Toni Morrison. And she would pick, I don't know what it was, maybe 5 or 6 students, maybe 4 or 5 students each year. And the idea would be, instead of writing short stories, you write one longer piece. And so I spent the entire semester writing the entire first draft of my first novel. So I think she wanted to get like 50 pages, and I handed in 200 pages for her to read. But she was, an incredibly generous teacher. She read the whole thing. She gave me her notes. She was very helpful. And there were a couple of things that she said that have stayed with me. One of the things was that she would read our work out loud every day, every class, once a week we'd meet. And when she read our stuff out loud, it sounded so amazing. She was one of the great writers of the 20th century, but she was also probably the greatest reader I've ever met. So she could read our work, and suddenly you thought, wow, this has real power. This is really something. And something which I took away from that class was to read my stuff out loud over and over again. So in a typical writing day, I wander around the room I'm writing, typing in my computer maybe for an hour or 2. But for 3 or 4 hours, I'm pacing around with a printout of my book, reading it out loud over and over again. And I think that the way that writing works is that we imagine that we're getting writing through our eyes, that it's something that we see, that most of us, will read books in print or electronic form. But I think that language works through our ears. It works in terms of how it sounds. And so very quickly, my approach to writing became a very oral approach. And the questioner was asking about the sentences and how they work. And so there are these long sentences in the book. And the way these sentences, I imagine these sentences working is that they build up certain rhythms. And hopefully those rhythms take you along. And if you encounter an idea that you find strange or unsettling, or you don't agree with, the sentences keep going. You don't get to pause and stop at that point. You keep going to the end of the sentence, which might be quite some distance away. And by the time you can stop and reflect on what's happened, in a sense, you've already taken it on board. And that idea of sort of moving forward, of slipping from one idea to the next, of raising an idea and then playing with it and then accepting it, changing it, I think that's quite true to how we are as people. We often, if we're allowed to, in our private space, sort of think about things, we'll have an idea and then we'll think, no, that's not quite right. And then we'll think, that's not quite right. We'll keep playing with it. It's only when we say, this is my idea, and we say it publicly, that we feel like we have to die by that idea. Like, that's our idea. We can't change our mind. And so in a sense, this is a novel really about changing perspective and changing one's mind, and the characters changing their minds. And the sentences are built hopefully to facilitate that.
Wilson, very good. Thank you very much. That was quite interesting. And it's a good segue to our next question as well, which is, did the first sentence come to you fully formed or require wordsmithing? Did you write it first thing or did it come later? I feel it has the ring of something iconic. The only parallel I can think of is J.R.R. Tolkien. In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit.
So the first sentence was where the book began. And in a sense, the first sentence, I knew what I wanted to happen in the beginning of the book. And I knew where we wanted to go. And what I might just do here, just to pause for a quick second, is just to read that first sentence for people who are listening who haven't heard it. It's a pretty long sentence, but well, actually, I'll read the first 2 sentences, in fact, if you don't mind.
Absolutely.
One man. Oh, sorry. Here we go. One morning, Anders, a white man, woke up to find he had turned a deep and undeniable brown. This dawned upon him gradually, and then suddenly. First, as a sense, as he reached for his phone, that the early light was doing something strange to the color of his forearm. Subsequently, and with a start, as a momentary conviction that there was somebody else in bed with him, male, darker. But this, terrifying though it was surely impossible. And he was reassured that the other moved as he moved, was in fact not a person, not a separate person, but was just him, Anders, causing a wave of relief. For if the idea that someone else was there was only imagined, then of course the notion that he had changed color was a trick too, an optical illusion or a mental artifact, born in the slippery halfway place between dreams and wakefulness, except that by now he had his phone in his hands and he had reversed the camera and he saw that the face looking back at him was not his at all. So that's how the book begins. There's a first sentence, which is like a line and a half. There's a second sentence, which sort of takes us for the rest of the page and onto the next page. The first sentence, I guess, sets up a little bit of the rhythm and the tone, and it introduces this very strange development right at the beginning, that we know that Anders has sort of changed. The second sentence then takes that and sets up the rhythm of the language. And so hopefully those first two sentences, which constitute the first paragraph of the book, do a couple of things. They introduce the reader to the idea that this is a novel where the main character has suddenly changed color and where people are going to do that. Because there's a certain contract, I think, between the writer and reader, a certain understanding. And in a way, it's, the first sentence says, this is the kind of book this is going to be. And the second sentence then takes that and kind of flows with it. Anders is thinking one thing, then the other, and he's looking again. And the second sentence, in a sense, is presenting the reader with, this is how this book is going to flow. And so in a way, the two sentences together function as a kind of introduction. It's like when you meet somebody for the first time and they say, my name is Mohsin and here's something about me. And you do the same thing. And so that's really, how I thought about those. But in terms of where they come from, and the first sentence, as you say, it really was my way into the book. And once I had that first sentence, I had a way in. And once I had the first two sentences, I sort of felt like I had a book coming. And it didn't change much thereafter. Once they were written, they stayed like that with minimal change until the book was done.
Beautiful. I do have a question from the audience too, but we received questions ahead of time as well. A few questions. I'm just going to, since we are in continuation of the conversation, I'm going to pose that question and then I'll come to one of the audience questions here too. So the question is, I don't know where this book is set and realized only afterwards that may be the point. Was this ambiguity a conscious choice from page and draft one, or a decision you came to later? Why?
Yeah, it was a conscious choice. And I think it has to do something with what I think written fiction can do. So right now, we have three main mass reproduced storytelling forms. We have cinema and television, which are kind of merging now because we stream our films on our TVs. But we have cinema and television are the two most, I guess, popular forms. And the third form really is books. It's written fiction. Now, what cinema and television do is they give you a world that looks like the world. So in a film of us meeting, Masood would look like Masood and I would look like me. And the room where we met would look like a room, and the tea we were drinking would look like tea, and you'd hear us speaking. And it would be a lot like the actual world that we live in, or that we think that we live in. And you're a viewer of that. But a book is nothing like that. In a book, you basically see letters, spaces, and punctuation marks against a white background. It looks nothing like the world. It doesn't sound like the world. It is this strange thing. And then you, the reader, take this sort of source code and you take it into your imagination And suddenly your imagination creates this experience. The reader of a book isn't like the viewer of a film. The viewer of a film, in a sense, is a viewer. The reader of the film is the casting director, the cinematographer, the director, the location scout of the book. Which is why when we read the book, two different people, we might have two very different senses of what it would look like. And we could see a film that's adapted from that book. One of us would say, oh, that's a lot like the book. And the other one would say, it's nothing like the book, because we imagined it differently. And I think it's quite a special thing. I think that that this ability or invitation to readers to imagine, to create a story out of their imagination is really what's very special about written literature. And I think what novelists do is we don't actually write novels. We write these kind of half novels. And readers take these half novels and they make them in their imagination into full novels. And since I think that's the case, what I often try to do in my books is I try to write, sort of small books that leave a lot of space for readers to imagine. So in The Last White Man, only two characters have names, Anders and Una. The other characters don't have names. The place is not named. The town isn't named. A lot of what's happening isn't really described. We see close up what's happening to Anders and Una and their father, his father and her mother, but we don't see too much of the societal change happening in the backdrop. We get little glimpses of it. And what I think that does is it frees up the reader to imagine it in their own way. And in the novel, one thing which I was very, I guess, particular about doing was I wanted there to be four main characters, all of whom begin the novel, thinking that they're white. And there would be no character who was, brown or black, who would really have a large role. And the reason for that was I didn't want to create a character where I could sort of say, this is what I think about what's going on. This is what I, the writer, think is correct or good or morally upright. And I didn't want to give a character the reader could look to and say, how is this person reacting to this? How am I supposed to interpret this? This person is going to be a clue. The reader is forced to sort of imagine this thing themselves. And then what happens, hopefully, is the reader says, oh, wait, I imagined this. What does that mean? Why did I imagine it this way? And how did that make me feel? I think the subject of race is something that makes all of us uncomfortable. It's an uncomfortable domain. And so I think being able to sit by ourselves, in complete solitude, alone, having this kind of imaginative experience around race, and then seeing what that made us feel and what that brought out in us is a way to, I guess, explore something that we have very little, comfort or freedom to explore when we're with other people, or we have a different kind of comfort and freedom with other people. And so in the same way that two children can get together and say, look, let's play pirate, or let's play house. And then they start, or let's play dinosaurs. And suddenly they stop being children and they become, two women in a house, or they become two pirates, or they become a T-Rex and a Brontosaurus or whatever. In the same way that children do that, I think that readers and writers, well, particularly readers, enter this imaginary world. So that's why the novel is written in that way, and it leaves those kind of spaces for readers to fill.
How did the idea of this book came to you? I have heard you in interview talk about the origin story for The Reluctant Fundamentalist and how 9/11 shaped your experiences in America and inspired your writing. Does this latest novella feel equally personal?
Yeah, in a way it does. I guess, there are a couple of experiences in it that feel quite close. One experience, I think, in a sense, does go back to 9/11. And that idea of suddenly perceiving a shift in a sense of what group one belongs to, and what that group means to other people. And so in The Reluctant Fundamentalist, that novel deals very specifically with this encounter between sort of a Westernness and a Muslimness that are mutually suspicious. They may not even exist, but they, in the novel, are sort of presented in a way where it's very easy to imagine that they are in opposition, even though the novel kind of, again, leaves it to the reader to believe that. not much happens in the novel that makes it clear that that's actually a real tension, but the tension begins to build because we're already scared of each other. But in this novel, I wanted it not to be specifically about the sort of Muslim Western split, but really about this feeling of race and of a sense of loss that so many people around the world are feeling as various dominant groups are challenged. And so whether this is in Pakistan, people who feel that a traditional way of life or traditional understanding of Islam is being challenged by contemporary life, whether it's in India, the rise of sort of Hindutva and the notion of a politicized Hinduism and Muslims being sort of the opposition, or in Turkey, the idea of a kind of resurgent Turkishness, or in Putin's Russia, the idea of a resurgent, Russianness. And you see that in Brexit Britain, you see it in American politics very clearly in the last few years in particular. All over the world, you see groups feeling like their way of life, their group is under threat. Something is being lost. And that creates a kind of nostalgic politics where we say, where some people tell us that, we should go back to how things used to be. It was better 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, or 500 years ago, or 1,000 years ago. And all of these politicians who tell us, let's go back to the better days, I think are playing on a sense of nostalgia that we have, because we feel that things are changing very quickly and we feel that we're losing something. And so what I wanted to do in this novel was to really take very seriously this question of loss, this idea of what does it feel to be losing something, and to write about these four characters losing things in different ways, losing loved ones, losing their youth, losing, in a sense, their belonging to a particular group, and to see if it's possible to, in a sense, explore that feeling of loss, but come to a different endpoint than the endpoint of going back to the past. And so, yeah, that I think was very much, I guess, the underlying impetus to write the book.
So it's a personal experience that one of our audience is sharing. I can definitely relate to the experience of being singled out based on your looks. Years ago, after graduating from college, I visited Prague, Czechoslovakia in 1985. I recall being given double takes, finger pointing, and the sheer awe of Czech citizens seeing me, a Black American woman, casually sauntering through their city. At the time, it was a bit unsettling, but I didn't detect any malice, just surprise. How would you speak to the reception you are greeted with now and in the past?
So I think that it's very interesting. We can react to difference, and we can react to people that we think of as different from ourselves in very different ways. And I think a lot of it depends on the stories we choose to believe. So one story is, that in a sense, people are on various human journeys that are similar and different, and in a sense bounded in the individual, but that there are ways that we can think of our journeys as being the journeys of relatives. That that person maybe speaks a different language, but they're also a parent. That person, has a different colored skin from me, but they've also lost a loved one. That person, doesn't speak my language, but they also are a writer, and I'm a writer. Or this person next to me is, Japanese, and I'm Pakistani, and we're sitting in this restaurant, but we both like sushi. And you start thinking about these stories, and you can imagine a way into, in a sense, the differences that we can use to divide ourselves. You can imagine those just being, in a sense, different facets of our identity, but not the most important facet in the moment. Maybe being parents is more important. Maybe liking sushi is more important. Maybe being writers is more important. But if we have different kinds of stories that tell us that there's a group of people who hates our kind of people and is a threat to our kinds of people, then very quickly those threatening stories take us down a road where we overlook the fact that we're both parents and that we're both writers and that we both like sushi. And suddenly it becomes, oh, this is that kind of person. And in most countries, there will be a history of groups being, persecuted precisely on this basis for a long period of time. And whether that's, Muslims in contemporary India, or non-Muslim minorities in contemporary Pakistan, or African Americans in America, or Catholics in when the British had colonized Ireland. These instances where we create a hierarchy of groups and put people into other groups has gone on for a very long time, and it has more and less horrifying forms. Some of the most horrifying forms which we see around us and have seen throughout history are almost unimaginably horrifying. And part of the question becomes, how do we find our way out of this? Because race, for example, is an imaginary thing, right? Like races don't actually exist. There are mountains and clouds and zebras. Those things exist. But race is something that we've kind of imagined into existence. Several hundred years ago, during the Christian reconquest of Spain, when the Catholic kings and queens were reconquering Spain, which had been under the rule of Muslim kings and queens for many centuries. At that time, the main question being asked wasn't, are you African or European? Are you black or white? It was, are you Christian, or are you a Muslim or a Jew? And then when the reconquest was nearing its completion, there was a question of, okay, well, what if people are pretending to be Christians? How do we know that they're really Christians? And then it became, well, maybe if they're descended from Jews or they're descended from Muslims, they're not really Christians, and we need to look into their background more closely. And then that becomes a kind of racialization. But the ancient Greeks wouldn't have thought of race the way we think of race today. Neither would the ancient Chinese or the ancient Indians. The modern idea of race of the colonial period and of American history is a few centuries. And I think it's quite reasonable to imagine that a few centuries from now, it won't exist. We'll have different ways of thinking about each other. So I think that, for me, the idea of a story or many stories told by many people where we destabilize race, where we sort of pretend that it's starting to buckle, starting to shimmer, starting to become unstable, is interesting and useful for us to do, because if we can move away from the stories that we tell about people being of different races and there being a hierarchy of races, and we can move away from the stories that tell us to be frightened of people who are different from us, there's hopefully more potential for us to move into a better future, or so I think.
Very good, Hamid. We got another interesting question here too. I know the book is still relatively new, but I'm curious if Mr. Hamid has any ideas yet of how the book and its central thought exercise about race and identity has been received differently in different countries and cultures. If it is too early to know this, where the last white man is concerned, then I would pivot to ask how the Reluctant Fundamentalist has been received differently in different parts of the world. Thank you for your time.
So with the last white man, it's still very soon. But I think, more than in different countries and cultures, I think different readers react differently to books. I think partly that's because different readers make different books in their imagination. So two different readers reading this book are going to make two different books out of it, depending on how they imagine it. Also, of course, people have different views, different politics, etc. So, there are some people who've reacted to The Last White Man by saying that this book, in a sense, tries to empathize with racism and it excuses racism. Other people have said that it's, who are you to try to write these characters? Other people have said that this, in fact, is a racist book and it is advocating, the erasure of white people, etc. And I think in many ways, those reactions are the reactions that people have had, in a sense, to their experience of reading the book. But there are other people who have different reactions and who have found the book helpful or interesting or provocative in a good way, or moving or useful or worthwhile. And I think the same thing was true of Reluctant Fundamentalist, is that reading in a way isn't a team sport. We do it individually. And so to think that there's an American response to this book, or there's an American response to Reluctant Fundamentalist, or a Pakistani response to these two books, I think is a mistake, because different Pakistanis read in different ways. I still remember these two young men, this young man coming to me at this literary festival in Karachi, and asking about Reluctant Fundamentalists, saying, my friend and I are big fans of Moth Smoke, your first book, and we really looking forward to Reluctant Fundamentalist, and so, but unfortunately we were very disappointed, and so I bought a ticket to come and give you this letter by bus, by many hours from where we live. And this letter, and what we were disappointed was, we really thought that Moth Smoke was a very sexy book, and it had these great sex scenes, and now Reluctant Fundamentalist isn't like that at all, and you really let down your readers, and I mean, it's interesting, right? Like, so is that a typically Pakistani reaction? No, but there's no such thing as a typically Pakistani reaction. And I think so. For me, what I learned as I travel around the world, with my books, is just how different people are within one country, and even one city, and even one family. Sometimes I sit with my parents and my sister discussing a book, and we'll have completely different reactions to it. So yeah, I think there's a wide range of reactions, but hopefully, it does seem that some people seem to find it, useful to them.
Very good. We got 4 more questions and about 10 minutes left, Mohsin. So let's see if we can cruise through those. Did you write the manuscript during the pandemic? While the themes are different, the reactions of characters to a global and scary changes is resonant with COVID-19. Holding up in one's house, suicides, many people soldiering up, and so forth.
Yeah, it was written. It was written largely during the pandemic, and in many ways, for me, it was a kind of pandemic novel. It's a novel where you begin to know that something is happening in the distance, and then it happens to one person in the community, then a few, then it begins to spread, and people are panicking, and you don't know how bad things are going to get. Will society break down? Will we have a complete descent into chaos and violence? And like the pandemic, in a way that it sort of ebbs and flows. But also, one thing which the pandemic, I think, did was the pandemic ripped open this illusion that what we call reality is how things really are. If you'd said to us before, any of us before the pandemic, that, oh, next year your kids won't be going to school and flights between countries will be closed, and you'll be only talking to people on your computer and not meeting them in person, and you would say, this crazy. Of course it's not going to happen, but it did. And so in a way, the novel is like that. It's about something which seems impossible, but in the time of the pandemic, a lot of impossible things happen, so maybe it's not so impossible.
Beautiful, Mohsin. I'm going to ask you a last question about the book, and that's my question. I have the book right in my hand here too. I made some notes here. So chapter number 13, the last paragraph, and I'm going to read some excerpts here. And Anders' pale father was the only pale person present, the only pale person left in the entire town, for there were by that point no others. And then his casket was closed and his burial was occurring. And he was committed to the soil, comma, the last white man, comma. And after that, after him, there were none. So in the entire book, as you mentioned earlier on too, there were just 2 characters that were named, Anders and Una. No one else has been named. No places have been named, right? But I find this quite interesting that at the end of this chapter number 13, there's one last word here. There are a few words here that resonates with the title of the book, The Last White Man. Was that on
Yeah.
purpose?
Yeah, very much so. So in a way, in the novel, the last person who can be thought of as or looking like they are white is Anders's father.
Mhm.
He's dying in the course of the novel, and who knows, if he had lived, perhaps he too would have changed. We don't know what would have happened to him. But Anders's father is desperately trying to pass something on to his son. He's trying to give his son something, and Anders is trying to, in a sense, connect with his father, and the feeling of loss that Anders is having is the loss not just of his own skin color, his own racial identity, but it's also the loss of this man, his father, and in a sense his ancestry, where he comes from. And I think that for me, their relationship and Anders's father's attempt to give to his son something even in his dying, to convey a sense of dignity, and in a sense to reassure his son that he can face this, is the gift that his father is trying to give him. And these two men, one of whom is the last of his kind in a sense, and one is the one who has to live afterwards. To me, there's something very much about this nature of the moment that we live in today, where so many people feel that they are losing their identity, and that is, I think, encapsulated in the relationship between these two.
Very good. Last two questions. What Pakistani authors would you recommend to a reader who has devoured all your books and the backlist of Nadeem Aslam as well? What are you yourself reading now?
So Kabila Shamsi is a wonderful writer. She has a new novel that's just come out, I think, last week, and very much worth reading. Danyal Moinuddin is a superb writer and has a collection of short stories. His second book, I think, will be out in a year or two, but his collection of short stories, In Other Rooms, Other Wonders, is absolutely fantastic. Muhammad Hanif is an incredible writer, both as a journalist and also has a sort of wickedly dark sense of humor, writes fantastic politically incisive fiction. Maybe I would recommend his first book, Case of Exploding Mangoes. And there's so many others. I assume that the reader there, the questioner there is somebody who wants to read in English, but in the English language, those would be some of the writers that I would recommend.
Very good. Mohsin, the last question of the day, and we have about 4 minutes. What can you tell us about the film adaptation of Exit West?
So
what is Mr. Hamid's role with the project? How did you learn that Netflix and the Obamas were interested in Exit West? I bet that's a fun story.
Yeah, well, it is, I guess, a fun story. So there was a whole journey involved where first I was approached by the production company Agbo, which was set up by the Russo brothers, who were behind many of the Avengers films, and then by Higher Ground Productions, which is the Obama's production company, and also Riz Ahmed, who was a friend and who was the star of Reluctant Fundamentalist, brilliant British Pakistani actor who got involved in helping to shape the project. And it's been moving through this process of trying to find the right screenplay, of trying to bring it to life in the right way. And it's interesting because, in a way, as I said before, I write these novels that leave a lot of space for people to imagine them differently. And then when it's time to make a film, it's very challenging because, how do you want to imagine this? Like, what do you want to make out of it? So at this stage, the project is going through different screenplays, and a new one has just come in, and hopefully that one is going to be the one that sticks. I think everybody would be keen to do it next year, but as I've learned in the film sort of business, the little that I know of it, is that you never quite know when things are going to go ahead. But I think, you know, it's exciting, and I hope that it does go ahead next year.
Well, Mohsin, any final thoughts for the audience? You got about a minute.
No, it's been a pleasure. I've always enjoyed my visits to Minnesota in the past. One of my best friends is a native Minnesotan. He's from Minnesota, and he's also a Native American. The writer David Troyer. And so if any of you haven't read David's stuff, he's an incredibly fine novelist, and I would suggest picking him up.
Well, we'll absolutely love to stay in touch, Mohsin. Next time you're in Minnesota, make sure we connect.
I would like to. Thank you. Thank you, Masood.
That's a wrap for this afternoon. That's all we have time for this afternoon. Thank you again, Mohsin, for penciling us into your busy fall.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure hosting you.
Thanks.
This has been a virtual presentation of Club Book, a long-running literary series of MELSA made possible by the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. Special thanks again to Ramsey County Library for the part they played in bringing Mohsin to us. Before you log off, look for the Club Book survey link, which is in the comments and will be projected in place of my video momentarily. Last, consider joining Club Book tomorrow for an in-person event with book club favorite Kristen Harmel, author of The Sweetness of Forgetting, the Book of Lost Names, and other chart-topping works of historical fiction. She will be appearing at 7 p.m. at Prior Lake Public Library. The event is free, but seating is on a first-come, first-served basis. So plan on arriving early. Visit bookclub.org for details. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Mohsin.
Thank you.
I think we are done, and the Facebook Live should be done by now. There we go.
Masood, it was a real pleasure. Thank you for doing that. And yes, I hope we get to meet in Minnesota one of these days.
जी इंशाल्लाह आप कभी चक्कर लगाए सर तो बताइएगा तो यूएस वगैरह चक्कर आए तो जरूर ब्लॉक कर दोगी कभी कराची का चक्कर हुआ तो I know that I have your contact details too. I'll absolutely drop a note, sir.
Please do, please do. Thank you so much for your time, and until next time.
Absolutely, best of luck.
And to you, Khud Hafiz.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Ing, as well.
Thank you guys.
Probably come back on the camera now.